Hi friends, I'm Unique. This video is being recorded right after my first clear of P12S Phase 2, and with that, I have cleared Pandaemonium Anabaseios Savage in the entire expansion Pandaemonium Raid series. I joined a new static this tier with the goal of clearing all the fights within 8 weeks, and we managed to meet that goal on week 7. I've been raiding since Eden's Promise when Echo was added, and this has been the fastest I've ever cleared a tier. This is a drastic increase from Asphodelos, where I was raiding pretty much the entire tier, and Abyssos, where it took all the way to patch 6.3. I have more to say, but first, I want to talk about my thoughts on the fights. I'll talk more about my thoughts on the tier overall at the end. So P9S, I immediately started comparing to E9S, since this tier should be comparable to Eden's Promise, and there's a lot of Protean mechanics, partner mechanics going. Eden's Promise is a tier I've cleared and am familiar with. Honestly, I thought E9S was more fun because of the movement and tile memes, but this fight was fine. Once you get the mechanics down and get past the memes with the Earth AoEs, the only two major mechanics of this fight are Limit Cut 1 and slightly less Limit Cut 2. Both mechanics serve as body checks and have body checks immediately after them. The Limit Cuts you have to be consistent on, and my advice to people progging this is if you don't like one strat for Limit Cut 1, then you should consider trying the other. My static cleared this fight week 1, and we committed to the Oppo strat because it's just what we ended up being more comfortable with. After we finished Limit Cut 2, I think it only took us like 3 pulls to clear, so if you can get past that, you're seeing the light soon. My static took 2 nights to clear this fight, which felt so insanely fast to me because I've never cleared a Savage that quick before. Healing this fight was pretty fine. I actually never did Savage on Scholar. This fight was a pretty good warm-up for me because let me tell you, those later fights, you gotta know how to heal. I am so glad to have met up with this group because I can only wonder where other groups are at. I can totally picture groups still trying to clear this fight because they're stuck being consistent at Limit Cut. The second floor is the big scary spider guy, and this is easily the scariest fight of the lower 3 floors. People say P10S is the most challenging second floor we've seen in a Savage tier for a long time, and I totally agree. The bonds mechanic can get very frustrating because you are trusting people to read their debuffs and respect some awful snapshots. I played Scholar this tier, and it's so important to mitigate and throw out your healer bubbles because the bleeds in this fight feel stressful, especially early on in prog when you are not geared. I didn't like the movement in this fight, but that's just something you gotta deal with as a caster. It's just hoping. This fight is definitely challenging, but I'm not sure if I like it. It just feels intensely challenging as a second floor for people in Party Finder, and I can imagine so many poor souls stuck at Bonds 3 or Harrowing Hell because people just don't want to plan out their mitigations. My static took 3 nights to clear this fight, thanks to amazing callouts, especially with Bonds, because I'm telling you, you'd think reading your debuffs would be easy, but you'd be surprised once you go into the Party Finder. My static still uses Tank LB for Harrowing Hell, because once you have the gear, the DPS check doesn't feel too painful. If you can get through Harrowing Hell, the fight is pretty much over. I mean, there's still mechanics, but it's all repeats, and it's pretty smooth sailing from there. Overall, this fight is very interestingly designed, but in my opinion, it has tighter movement than even the third floor. P11S is thematically my favorite fight of the tier. I know more experienced raiders constantly say it's a rehash of E11S, but I have really bad memory of, and I also did that fight on Black Mage, not Scholar, so the fight felt different enough to me. This fight is a bit easier than P10S, but just like the third floor of Abyssos, this has a tighter DPS check that is not a slouch. I've seen a small amount of groups at a range prog, especially early on in the tier, but I know now with gear it's way more manageable, but it's still totally possible to see in rage on this fight with screw-ups, assuming you don't wipe the raid with your screw-ups. The mechanics are pretty easy to understand until the light and dark and light mechanic. That requires a bit of explanations for everyone to be on the same page with positioning, but I think it's reasonable enough to get consistent on that mechanic. I think the secret hard mechanic for this fight is Letter of the Law. If you do not position correctly, and it's pretty quick positioning too, it is very possible you will cause a wipe. Especially towards the end, if you eat that knockback, your party might not have enough people to live the stack. without a tank LB. I remember my first time seeing Letter of the Law, I was constantly being overwhelmed on trying to figure out where the hell to go. I recommend muting yourself in VC and giving yourself callouts. Doing callouts for myself helps me actually understand the mechanic. I still do callouts for myself on re-clears. By the way, make sure to pop anti-knockback the moment the boss says, "These magics." You'll thank me later. The autos on this boss hit surprisingly hard. The raid wides and mechanics definitely hit hard. But I learned how to get better on Scholar very quickly thanks to P10S in this fight too. I recommend, by the way, if you're a healer that has a ground placement bubble, to macro that so that it's centered on the boss, because it really helps with positioning. My static took 7 nights to clear this fight because of how late Dark and Light and Letter of the Law are in the fight. In some ways, this fight was good, but I still think it should have been a second floor fight because you feel like this fight is shorter than P10S, it's easier than P10S. I like this fight, but it should have been a second floor fight. P12S Phase 1 has no bleeds, but is such an insanely fast fight. Super Chain 1 and 2 feel very overwhelming to analyze at first, and surprise, there's yet another limit cut. This fight has tight positioning in some ways that feel fast or even faster than P10S, especially since this has some of the jankest snapshots I've seen since the first Criteria dungeon. Personally, I like it more than P8S Phase 1 because of the consistent timeline. However, I prefer E12S's door boss more because of the slightly slower pacing and way more opportunities to recover. This phase also has the highest DPS check of the entire tier if you don't include downtime. The fact that even with gear you are still expected to output crazy DPS during Super Chain 2 to kill the boss before she kills you feels crazy. I know people call the DPS check for the final floor of this tier very lenient, but I'm still seeing parties killing the boss during Super Chain 2, so... Oh, by the way, there is a 2-minute window during Super Chain 1 and Super Chain 2 Alpha, with the latter being a pot window. Both feel really, really bad to do on healer, and I need to take the time to look at some parse POVs when 6.45 drops, because I still have trouble outputting some good damage during Super Chain 2 Alpha. Hopefully with gear, especially in 6.3, when you can augment the Tombstone weapon pretty easily, this DPS check will feel nowhere as stressful to me. Granted, I did get the raid weapon first week of our clear of P12S, but I'm just saying this for other people who are trying to prog this fight. My static took 8 nights to clear Phase 1, and I can understand why. Re-clears for the lower floors were rough, and for myself personally, trying to figure out where the hell to go and when to move, and when to swap in and out during limit cut felt really, really bad. If you do not do that limit cut mechanic correctly, there is a body check towards the end where you need everyone up or you're just going to take too much damage from the stack raid wide when wipe. Every mechanic past the 2-minute window for this fight feels like a wall, so don't feel too bad if you're stuck at something because literally every mechanic feels like a wall. Phase 2 is a very polarizing fight to go into after Phase 1. It has slightly less tight positioning and way less quick execution. This fight, starting with the first PlayStation mechanic, feels like puzzle after puzzle after puzzle. You don't necessarily have to be quick with your positioning, just precise. It also helps that I lined up Expedient with actual movement-intensive mechanics. I think the boss taking up the whole arena felt okay because everyone could comfortably hit the boss with something, hopefully something optimal, while they were trying to resolve their mechanic. You pretty much need to look at a diagram for the PlayStation mechanics, Caloric Theory 1 and 2, and especially Pangenesis, because if you aren't standing in the right spot, you are likely to wipe the raid immediately. This fight has no bleeds, and everyone had quite a bit of gear, so it was pretty comfy throwing out shields or occasionally eating raid wides if I didn't have Sacred Soil. There were some moments where my co-healer and Fairy absolutely carried me because of how spread out the party is right before a raid wide. Thank goodness the range for mitigations got buffed though. While there is no bleeds, there is constant raid wide damage going out during these puzzle mechanics. The DPS check for this is easier than phase 1 if you don't count downtime, so we cleared pretty quick once we stopped having deaths in the first like 5 minutes of the fight. My static took 12 nights to clear phase 2 because of the amount of people who had to be out, my own shenanigans trying to figure out where to go during Pangenesis, and our group trying to find consistent positioning during PlayStation 2. I feel like the major wall for this fight has to be Pangenesis because trying to understand the standard system of where to go and reading your debuffs feels incredibly overwhelming at first. In fact, my static went into a random area and just put down markers and grabbed screenshots of our debuffs from my VODs to just simulate where to go during Pangenesis. If you're stuck on that mechanic, I highly suggest doing the same with your static because it improved our performance on that mechanic by miles. My favorite personal mechanic was caloric too because we just simulated that and got through that in like 3 pulls once we actually did that mechanic in game. The DPS check continues to be no slouch though because you still need to DPS the boss down, especially during UAV 2, even though you feel so close to the enrage. Overall, this boss was fine, but the music and pacing of the mechanics feels very jarring after phase 1. You're like using a different part of your brain for this fight. Thematically and mechanically, I still prefer E12S over this. That fight, thematically amazing. The mechanics very unique. This fight it's fine. In total, my static took 33 nights of about 3 hours per night to clear the tier, so about 100 hours. Considering we had a goal of clearing within 8 weeks, I think it's pretty good with our week 7 clear here. Week 7 is about to wrap up soon, so I know week 1 re-clear groups must be sighing in relief. To be honest, I think participation in this tier is the lowest I've seen since Eden's Promise. I think it makes sense because of no ultimate being soon and Abyssos being such a toxic tier and top also burning people out as well. To be fair, this tier's lower floors make Abyssos lower floors look like a cakewalk. Like try comparing P6S with P10S. There are so many moments where everyone in the party finder, or in a party in general, needs to be alive or there will be even more deaths or even a giant explosion that just wipes the whole raid, and that can feel really, really bad, especially during re-clears. There weren't as many body checks in the lower floors of Abyssos, but because of the way mechanics work this tier with so many partner mechanics, I can totally understand if people feel burnout of this tier much faster than Abyssos. I think this tier was good, but I'm sure once we give it more time, the community will come to a consensus that the tier was fine, but there were better final tiers. I personally prefer Eden's Promise over most of these fights, with the exception of the second floor, which was an amazing, unique design. However, I feel really bad for people in Party Finder or much more casual groups trying to figure out that fight. I hope the devs take the feedback seriously this tier because I think what they have going is good for Savage, but there's so much more to improve, like those body checks, the difficulty curve with these floors. I still think Eden's Promise had an amazing difficulty curve. Next tier will be in 7.05, which will reset to a much more beginner-friendly tier, and I hope to see more of my friends checking out Savage then. Or maybe I'll throw them into this tier once there's Echo, like I did for myself during Eden's Promise. I would also like to thank my static who took me in after my last static disbanded at the end of Abyssos. I still haven't lasted more than a tier with a group, but this has genuinely been my best experience raiding since Eden's Promise. If I was doing this tier solo or with some of my former groups, I'm pretty sure I would still be stuck at P9S Limit Cut Prog or something like that. With the tier done, I hope to tackle other content Endwalker has to offer, like the Criterion Dungeons, Eureka Orthos, or who knows, maybe I'll go back into Eden's Promise as Blue Mage. Anyway, I've been ranting long enough. Let me know what y'all's thoughts are on the tier so far in the comments section, and I will see you all in patch 6.45 when I post videos on the new Hildebrand quest and the new variant dungeon. Okay, bye friends.